Hi, Caroline, you're muted.
Thank you.
Still muted.
Thank you, Andy. Apologies. You'd think that this far into the pandemic, I would have remembered how to use the mute button. But I'd like to welcome all of you to the very first South Africa community call hosted by OCP. We're really excited to see such a good turnout and are really looking forward to deepening the community around procurement transparency, open contracting, and I think this is a crucial time for the country in looking at advocating for procurement reform. And so I would really like to call on everyone to engage in the material in today's discussion. This is an open discussion, and we hope it's the first of many such opportunities in which we can share experiences and come up with some joint strategies on how best to, in this circumstance, to respond to the Zondo Commission's report. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to our facilitator, Zukiswa Kota, who will be managing this call for us. We're very privileged and grateful to have such an esteemed facilitator managing this, and I'm sure many of you will recognize Zuki's face, and she's so intricately involved in these issues in the country. So thank you again, Zuki, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm not sure if I'm intricately involved in issues of corruption or intricately involved in CSO anti-corruption issues. I'm joking. Thank you so much, and really excited for this call, and particularly pleased to be able to facilitate what I think will be a really important conversation, and I think a commencing one. Perhaps just, I have seen that some people have taken the initiative already. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, where you're from, and anything else you think would be relevant or interesting. Treat it as you would a sort of tea room session or kind of pre-tea in a real workshop space. We unfortunately won't have time to have everyone introduce themselves, but hopefully at the very end we'll have a good chunk of time to have a conversation and hear people's voices. So really hoping to see other faces at the end of towards the end of our conversation, hear other voices in addition to our fantastic speakers. Before we get there, just to say as well that thank you for joining, and maybe a little bit of background about what it is we're hoping to talk about today. As many will know, and I do see there are quite a few that I recognize as people who are maybe not direct, not in South Africa, and not necessarily intricately or entwined with the context of the Zondo Commission. So I think it is helpful to give a little bit of background and hopefully not be too boring for the rest who have been, front and center in this space. The commission that is in its full name, the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, corruption, and fraud in the public sector, including state organs or organs of state. And I think that really captures precisely what the commission intended to do. It came out of discussions around remedial action that were taken by the public protector years back, Thuli Madonsela, the previous public protector, and at that time, from a report that was titled the State Capture Report. So this was about 2016. And that report came out of the first phase of an investigation that the Public Protector's Office had conducted, looking at complaints that had been received, speaking of allegations of improper conduct, particularly on the part of the president at the time, President Jacob Zuma. And of course, many of the implications were connected to a now notorious family, the Gupta family. So the remedial action that was in that initial report included that the president needed to appoint a judicial commission of inquiry that would be chaired by a judge selected by the Chief Justice of South Africa. The president at the time failed in his court application. He appealed to set aside that the public protector's report failed, and so the High Court then ordered him to appoint a commission within 30 days. And so following from that, the public, the Chief Justice at the time, put forward the name of a judge, Justice Raymond Zondo, hence the name of the commission, which we call the Zondo Commission. And so here we are. Since then, there have been sittings of the commission, public hearings, many of us who would have listened in on those, and I know some were directly involved in perhaps providing evidence or supporting the processes around the commission. Since then, there's been a litany of allegations, evidence given, and really just incredible content. Today, we're wanting to focus on part one of that report, which includes really important evidence around procurement transgressions, and at the end, also looking at recommendations around procurement in South Africa. So that's really our focus. Of course, the report, part one of the report is 800 plus pages. And I think today, really excited to then be looking at what is the role of civil society in ensuring that the recommendations are addressed? What are the ways in which we can provide support to the state to ensuring that the report doesn't just become yet another 800 page plus sitting on shelves collecting dust? And so today we have a great panel. We've got from Corruption Watch, Taryn Pillay. We've got from the Open Contracting Partnership, and I think this is going to be an interesting introduction as well to Edwin. We've got Edwin Muhumuza. From Amabungane, we've got Sharice Thakor. And from the Open Government Partnership, we've got Theo Chiviru, who will be talking us through some interesting, I think, putting together some of the conversations from today. I'm from the Public Service Accountability Monitor. My name is Zugiswa Kota, and particularly keen to really hear the ideas from our panel, but then again, the ideas that will come from our discussion later. I'm seeing some really amazing names in terms of people who've done fantastic work in this space. So I think it'll be a rich conversation. And so that's where we're at. Really hoping for an inclusive discussion. And again, as I say at the end, if you are able to put your camera on, we'd like to hear your voice. We'll be throwing questions at the panel, but of course, you as an audience can do the same, as participants can do the same. Before we get there, I'm going to hand back over to Caroline, who's going to talk specifically about the OCP's call and this aspect of a community call, what it's for, what its objectives are, and give us a little bit more detail. Caroline, back over to you before we hear from the panelists.
Great, thanks, Suki. Yes, as I mentioned in the very brief introduction I gave, this is OCP's very first South Africa community call. And for those, we've met many of you in various engagements that we've had recently, but for those of you that aren't familiar with the work of OCP, OCP is the Open Contracting Partnership. And it's an international organization committed to advocating for and developing open contracting standards and broadly procurement transparency around the world. Our focus in South Africa is to work with National Treasury as well as other stakeholders to modernize and develop the procurement system into one that is more effective, cost effective, creates value for money, and is at its core more transparent, which will then lead to greater efficiency in government, but also allow for more effective monitoring, both from internal and external sources. The community calls are really represent the desire to bring together voices from various groups of stakeholders in South Africa. We want to hear from representatives of civil society, representatives of the private sector, government representatives, so that we can start coming up with collaborative approaches to achieving the goals that we all so deeply and so fundamentally believe in, and create this resilient and transparent procurement system that will respond to the unique challenges of South Africa and what we've seen in the past. And as Suki mentioned, that the Zondo Commission has really laid bare that there is just, the way that the existing procurement system has been able to facilitate massive corruption, which of course leads to an inability of the state to provide services to the citizens, which is its core mandate. So as we are moving towards the responses to the Zondo Commission, I think this is a fundamental and a key moment in time for South Africa. And we felt that bringing together the community in this way to start conversations, to allow us to interact with each other and to come up with start coming up with some strategies on how we can respond to the Commission's recommendations and work with government to implement those recommendations that are specific to procurement and to the reforms that Deputy Chief Justice Zondo identified throughout the hearings of the Commission. So also, as Zuki mentioned, we really are hoping for engagement in this. We encourage you to use the chat to bring up some issues, highlight some points, and then we will be having that open discussion towards the end of the call, where we hope that we can get this conversation going and start bringing in some of those strategies. So I'm really looking forward to this call, but also to future engagements that we will hopefully be all interacting with. And again, I'd just like to welcome everyone and looking forward to hearing the presentations from the speakers, but then to a really rich discussion as we move towards the end. Zuki, I'll hand back to you now, and I'm sure everyone will join me in anticipating the exciting presentations.
Great. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Caroline. So yes, I think, as I said, each speaker has about 7 minutes, but actually we've got a little bit more leeway on that. And I'm keen to not be too restrictive of conversation, but again, an eye on having other voices in the space. So we're going to start right off with Taryn from Corruption Watch. And if I could ask that each speaker does have their video on, but also feel free to just share briefly as well, what you're working on in relation to the work in the space for anyone who isn't aware of each organization. Take it away, Taryn.
Thank you so much, Zuki, and hi everybody, to everyone on this call. So my name is Taryn Pillay. I'm working with Corruption Watch as a legal researcher. So Corruption Watch is a chapter of Transparency International in South Africa. Founded 10 years ago, we do a bunch of anti-corruption work in this space. And given that procurement is the area where most corruption happens, there's a clear overlap and a clear synergy in Corruption Watch's interest in this kind of work. So with my presentation, I'm going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to give some further context to the Zondo report. And I know Zuki's already done some of this, so I'll be fairly brief there. I'm going to give a summary of the 10 recommendations that come out of that report, specifically on procurement. And then I'm going to speak a bit about Corruption Watch's sense of how to respond to those recommendations and how to advocate for them. So some thoughts on strategy. So to begin, let me talk a bit about the context around which this report comes. So we've already heard that its roots are in 2016 with Thuli Madonsela's report. And Zuki pointed out the title of that report, which I think is important. That its focus is on state capture, corruption, and fraud in the public sector. One thing I want to flag here is, while it's true that the focus of the report is on the public sector, many private sector actors are also implicated in the report. So, for example, the consulting firm Bain in relation to SARS, and the accounting firm PwC in relation to SAA. So the report grew a lot from its initial scope as set by the public protector in 2016 to cover a wide range of actors, all of whom are implicated in procurement corruption in various ways. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Also now on the scope of the report, so it was initially meant to have a lifespan of 180 days. It ended up spanning over 4 years. There were 400 days of hearings, 75,000 pages of the transcript of those hearings, and over 1.7 million pages of documentary evidence. I want to emphasize this because I think it speaks to the immensity of the work of this condition in the context of South African history. This is pretty much the biggest undertaking since the TRC. And the fact that the report makes such definitive findings is really positive. So the report makes 2 kinds of findings. The first relate to individual accountability, for specific people who've done wrong, which we're not really going to focus on here. And the second are about systemic reform, about procurement reform, which I'm going to speak to in a second. Before I do, though, just two other points of context, which I think are important. One is that a lot is made of the cost of the commission, which is close to R1 billion. But I think it's important to contrast that cost with the amounts of money that are being lost here, right? So in Transnet alone, it was 41.2 billion rand in terms of contracts that were irregularly awarded. And in the Auditor General's report I think it was released around December, January 2020-21, the amount of irregular expenditure that had accumulated over the recent years that hasn't been recovered or condoned or written off stood at 488 billion rand, which is just immense. I think it's important to bear in mind the amounts of money being lost to the states and also the human costs that lie behind those amounts of money, which, as has been pointed out, is that citizens are deprived of goods and services and communities are impoverished. So final point before I speak to the substance of the recommendations, which is just, what is the value of a commission of inquiry in a democracy? And I think the response to that is that it's a vital tool for reestablishing public trust, for identifying how things go wrong and how they can be fixed. And I think this is clear internationally. For example, in the 2019 protests in Hong Kong, one of the 5 key demands of the protesters was that they set up a commission of inquiry into the police's behavior. So the thing I'm trying to get to here is that this report presents a massive opportunity for change, but a lot of the value of commissions like these only come out if these recommendations are able to translate into concrete changes into the institutional landscape that governs the country. So with an eye to that, let me now talk about the recommendations themselves, of which there are 10. And these come from Chapter 4 of the first part of the State Capture Report. So some of these deal more directly with procurement than others, and I'm going to try to flag that as I go. So the first one is a national anti-corruption charter to be signed by all parties. So that's everyone in government working in the space of procurement, businesses, all parties tendering for contracts. All of these people are to sign a code of conduct which is elevated into law by an act of parliament. And the report spends a fair amount of time detailing that and thinks that it's important. Secondly, and this is perhaps the biggest change, and a lot of the other recommendations rely on this, is this idea of an independent agency against corruption, specifically in public procurement. Now, the structure of this agency is envisioned as being roughly analogous to the Competition Commission in this country. So, and I don't want to get too much into the details here because they do lay it out quite extensively. I'm happy to go further into that if the conversation needs it. But broadly, it envisions having 5 subdivisions. So you'd have a council, you'd have the inspectorate, a litigation unit, a tribunal, and a court. And these five different subdivisions would all work with each other to provide a variety of support functions, right? So one of these is investigating whistleblower complaints, investigating reports, taking judgments on decisions, setting policy around procurement more generally, working on professionalizing the profession. And the key thing about this agency is that it would have to be independent and it would have to be properly resourced. Now, let me just speak to some of the other recommendations. So the third one is about greater whistleblower protection. This is kind of wrapped up in the independent agency, but it stands alone. And a really interesting feature of this is this idea of incentivizing disclosures. So if you as a whistleblower come forward with a true disclosure about procurement corruption, you would be able to recover some portion of the money that is recovered at the end. This is done internationally, and I think it's quite an interesting possibility in terms of a policy change that would really change the incentives for people. I think it could create big change. Fourthly, deferred prosecution agreements, which don't relate directly to procurement, but clearly have application. So a deferred prosecution agreement is an agreement made between a prosecuting authority and typically a corporation, where the prosecuting authority agrees to hold off on prosecution in exchange for cooperation and in exchange for commitment to certain terms. So fifthly is the creation of a procurement officer's profession, analogous to something like the Legal Practice Council in South Africa or SICA for chartered accountants, with an eye to professionalizing procurement. Sixthly is the enhancement of procurement transparency. And which is the whole subject of this talk. What they mean here, though, specifically is the incorporation of a certain set of standards which are laid out in the OECD Principles for Integrity for Public Procurement document, the incorporation of those standards by the National Treasury into all the procurement systems at national, provincial, municipal levels. And then after that are a bunch of slightly smaller legislative amendments. So criminal and civil protection for accounting officers, an amendment to one of the anti-corruption acts to strengthen duties on the private sector, and an amendment to the Political Party Funding Act to criminalize donations that are made in expectation of receiving procurement tenders. And then the final recommendation, also kind of, which has a bunch of parts to it, is about harmonizing the public procurement framework. Something the report talks about is, since 2002, at least, there's been a long line of research in South Africa that points to the fact that the procurement system has been sprawling, has been fragmented, and has been vulnerable to corruption. Zondo uses the analogy of a pandemic here to say that state capture aggressively attacked a system which was already weakened by long-standing comorbidities in reference to the procurement system. So that's a brief overview of the recommendations. Now, with the remainder of my time, let me move quickly to just speak about Corruption Watch's perception of these things. So the starting point here is considering the government position currently, which is that they will respond to these recommendations in June, once they had time to digest the report. So, I think the question is, what can we do in the meantime until June? And then what can we do after June to keep putting pressure to ensure that actions are taken? So from Corruption Watch's perspective, these recommendations are welcome on several fronts, particularly the independent agency and the need for strengthened whistleblower protections and the harmonization of public procurement legislation. These are all very positive and welcome developments if they come about. But it's important to situate these recommendations in the context of what's come in South Africa's anti-corruption landscape before the Zondo Commission. And I'm thinking here particularly of the Public Procurement Bill, which was proposed some years ago now and has been pretty much just languishing, and also of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which was released in November 2020. It relies on 6 central pillars, one of which is about procurement transparency. And despite being a great detailed document with steps to lay out what should happen next, has seen very little movement in the meantime. For example, the NACS document proposes the creation of an advisory council in the interim as a forum for engagement with civil society and with other partners. And we haven't really seen anything around that yet. So part of working out our advocacy strategy going forward, I think a key part of that is grappling with where these recommendations fit within the broader anti-corruption landscape, and particularly within the NACS. Last 2 points and then I'll wrap up. So
yeah.
I will wrap up super shortly. So I just wanted to, and I'm sure other speakers will pick up on this, the power of technology as a tool to create change in putting pressure on achieving transparency is something that we think is quite exciting. So Corruption Watch has developed a procurement watch tool, which scrapes data from National Treasury to identify areas of deviations and expansions in contracts, to identify red flags in procurement, and then to act on those. So that's still a work in progress, but it's an example of the kind of ecosystem that can grow out of civil society to do work in this area. And just to close, the thing I would want to emphasize is the need for civil society to collaborate together in taking steps to implement these recommendations. And we've already seen a lot of good movement here. So for example, there's the Procurement Reform Working Group, which currently exists and has 4 or 5 civil society organizations, and the Political Party Funding Coalition, which similarly is an example of civil society collaborating to put pressure on government to achieve these kinds of changes. And I'm sure other speakers will pick up on this and take it further. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks for that, Darren. And yeah, it really was dying not to cut you off. Yeah, I think we'll go each speaker and then actually just open up with a few follow-up questions in a more open panel. I think we can hand over to our Open Contracting Partnership representative, Edwin.
Thank you very much, Zuki, and I'm very glad to be on this platform. I'm my first call, of course, in this role as head of Africa at Open Contracting Partnership. Caroline had already briefed the audience on what the OCP does, but maybe I need to also introduce myself more. I was but previously for the last many years, I was working with the procurement regulatory body in Uganda, the PPDA, which is literally what Zondo Commission is also recommending for South Africa, to have a body like that. And interestingly, South Africa is one of the very few countries in sub-Saharan Africa that never actually got that independent regulator for public procurement. And so it's interesting that the Zondo Commission is now recommending that. But many of these recommendations have been the discussions that have been occupying a lot of the public procurement spaces across Africa. I may even add around the world, as certain interventions to prevent the issues that came up in this commission. Tari talked about the importance of such a commission, and that is to build public trust, regain public trust in public procurement. Public trust is very, very important in public procurement because it influences whether you get the good bidders to participate in such processes. Because if the trust is very low, you won't have the very credible firms attempting even to bid, because they don't trust the process to be free and fair, because public procurement is quite an expensive venture, even when you're just trying to bid. Taryn has gone through the key recommendations that in the Zondo report related to public procurement. What I need to emphasize is the importance of a broad coalition when we are thinking about these recommendations. Public procurement is too important to be just left to one group of people, either the politicians or the procurement practitioners, or you have to build a very broad coalition, as we've learned from other places. So there's space for civil society, space for the private sector, space for the government agencies. Even within the government agencies, you have the local government, you have the treasury, you have the different agencies of the state that need to come together and be included in that working group in procurement. It can't just be civil society, but we need to build a broad coalition that then discusses some of these recommendations, so that you have practical solutions in implementing them. As you've heard, there have been discussions in South Africa that have taken longer than should have happened, especially in relation to the legislative framework. And I think these recommendations should give an impetus to the government and all the stakeholders responsible to maybe fast track some of these issues, because the legal framework is the best. It's the best framework that every other thing is going to be built on. If you don't have a very good legislative framework, then it's very difficult to have all the other things even working effectively. OCP is working with the South African Treasury and civil society in supporting some of these processes already. And good thing, some of these recommendations are already speaking to what we've been thinking about. For example, enhancing transparency in public procurement is very important in building public trust. And how can this transparency be enhanced in practical terms? We've talked about open contracting, but what is that? First, there must be easy access to information on tenders, and also and to all people that are, of course, noted as stakeholders in public procurement. Where do they get information related to tenders? Who is getting these tenders? The issues of beneficial ownership that have come out of this Zondo Commission, but were already largely being discussed in South African media previously. Who is behind the companies that are getting tenders? So that beneficial ownership is very important, because then the public is able to know what's going on. But also, the more you create transparency, the more it becomes a deterrent for wrongdoing, because you put a flashlight on the goings on in public procurement, and therefore there's more accountability. These things that are coming out that were not necessarily something everybody likes, the ones who have interest in, of course, public procurement being an effective tool for service delivery. owing to the fact that a lot of this was being done in the dark. Now, with transparency and getting more open in the way public procurement is being conducted, you then have improved transparency, but also this improved transparency, of course, then helps in better procurement outcomes. E-procurement is a game changer in many societies. OCP is working, of course, with the Treasury to enhance that capability. There are efforts already undergoing different areas in the South African government to implement e-procurement. E-procurement creates a very strong platform on which the things I'm talking about can be actualized. It's very difficult, for example, to have strong transparency if you're still using a paper-based system, if you're not publishing information. So, whereas it's not one of the key recommendations, I hope that this discussion going forward, we start discussing deeply how e-procurement or automating most of these processes can be done to leverage technology to improve the efficiency and also the transparency in the procurement process. So e-procurement is going to be a very important thing, and also getting it more coordinated, because right now there are a lot of reforms going on in the South African government across the states, also at the national level. However, the coordination elements need to be strengthened. Again, we're working with the Treasury to see how we can better have this coordinated across the country. I could also, lastly, emphasize the importance, I touched on it a little bit earlier, the importance of non-state actors getting involved in procurement oversight. In many places, the mistake has been for government to check itself. And because politicians who typically check government, or the opposition for that matter, are not directly involved in public procurement in one or another, the best oversight should be the public, represented through civil society, organized civil society, and the media. And I know that sometimes there's a tendency within government and also civil society to have tensions that are existing between these two very important partners. But we need to start having a conversation on how to strengthen relationships between the civil society and the government agencies, on how they share information, on how they reinforce each other in promoting public accountability in public procurement. So civil society needs to take its right place, but for civil society to do that also, there is need for them, of course, to be better equipped, to be better trained, to be better organized, so that they speak one voice, but also a voice that is constructive to the government agencies. Now, on the side of the government agencies, they need to be a bit more open. They need to be a bit more welcoming to ideas that these civil society organizations bring, because they usually represent what you'd call the beneficiaries of the outcomes of public procurement. And these beneficiaries are the public. As Taryn said earlier, procurement outcomes are meant for good service delivery. The people who usually suffer with bad procurement outcomes are the citizens, the poor lady in a suburb who can't get access to good medical care, who can't get access to clean water, a road user who is not getting a good road facility to make them move from one place to another, and so on and so forth. So these people's interests need to be reflected through the organized civil society. But once again, I congratulate the South African government and public for the commission. It's an important step for self-reflection. Once again, South Africa shows that once something goes wrong, it's possible to have a reflection through such commissions. And these reflections are important because once we are having conversations like these, I think it's the first step in the right direction. The important thing is to have these recommendations debated and clear way forward is put in place on how they get implemented and put into action, so that we don't have maybe many years from now another situation where we're discussing the same things. I thank you.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much, Edwin. I have given each speaker so far a little bit of extra time, and I'm still keeping an eye on that. And let's hear from Sharice. Handing over to you.
Thank you so much, Zuki, and really thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Just by way of introduction, I'm the advocacy coordinator at the Amabungane Center for Investigative Journalism. But this is a disclaimer that I've made at another OCP event. Although I'm a lawyer, I'm not a procurement specialist, and although I work with journalists, I'm not a journalist myself. I kind of fall somewhere almost in a civil society type role within Amabungane, where I advocate for the information rights and media freedom that enables journalists to do their very important work. And in addition to that, I also assist the journalists where they request information. So where there's requests in terms of the Promotion of Access to Information Act, or PAIA in South Africa, or requests from, for court records or share registers. I'm the one who helps to facilitate those requests. I think that when we consider the role of the media in reporting on procurement irregularities, we actually have to consider that they are somewhat limited. Really, what the media should be engaged in is diligent investigation and the exposure of wrongdoing. And then while the media can certainly then follow on and report on enforcement mechanisms, so kind of the procedures that follow, so that could be things like criminal proceedings, commissions of inquiry and the like, we're not supposed to wade into these kind of accountability mechanisms or enforcement mechanisms. I have to obviously add that those in the media can make comment on these, analysts and the like, but those should be clearly distinguished from the editorial work. So they must be marked clearly as such. And I think we can certainly consider that the media has made several groundbreaking stories concerning procurement corruption. Of course, Digital Vibes comes to mind. That was excellent reporting by Scorpio of Daily Maverick. There was also Maverick Citizens reporting on the tenders for sanitation of schools during COVID-19, which was found to be a largely unnecessary, a step in fighting against the pandemic. Our, Amabungane's Tabelo Timse reported on suspected irregularities in the procurement of COVID-19 PPE in the Northern Cape. Not on COVID-19, but we reported a suspicious award of a tender to an events and communications company that is alleged to have experienced interference by a state capture linked high-ranking official. That was all, I think, within the last 2 years. Going back a little bit further, there was, of course, the momentous Gupta leaks, which was a collaborative effort between Amabungane, News 24, and the Daily Maverick. And there, for instance, evidence about the, as you well know, the corruption linked to PRASA, which amounted into the billions, was exposed. So while most reporting happens after the tender is made, where there's allegations of impropriety in the award itself, journalists can also look into tender processes as they are underway. So an example of this is Amabungane, which is following the RMI 4P program. That's the program which seeks to procure further 200 megawatts of new generation capacity from a range of energy source technologies. So we're following that very closely, and part of the reporting has included allegations of potential irregularities in the award of the tenders to procure power from Turkish power ships. This award has run into regulatory roadblocks at the moment with the Department of Environmental Affairs. But I think it's important to note with all of these situations, Digital Vibes, COVID, PPE, power ships. The reporting also serves as public record, and we know this from the Zondo Commission, where journalists' records were included in part of the reporting. I know that they were very useful to the team at the Zondo Commission because they kind of provided that narrative input, and I think that's really where journalists come into the come to the fore, because there's masses and masses of information, as we know how much information was provided to the Zondo Commission. But if you look at it, journalists are able to pass that information. Sometimes it's very complicated financial records and the like. And journalists generate a narrative. And really that is the narrative that kind of sticks in the public imagination. So they really play that important role in bringing procurement corruption to the fore and really making it accessible to the public so they can understand exactly how, what went wrong and how and what is being done afterwards. So in order to report on procurement corruption, journalists encounter, they need a lot of information. As I mentioned, information is the lifeblood of journalism. And but they run into issues frequently. And this is something that I assist them with. But just to go through a very quick list of the many, many issues that we encounter regarding access to information. I'll start off with poor quality or patchy information, or information that's provided too late for reporting. And this can, when bad information is provided, it can require a kind of back and forth to say, we asked for all the tenders in relation to this, you've only provided some, but we know that there's others. And then that back and forth really eats up resources. Then there's the ever expanding class of confidential information. So especially with, there's roadblocks where, for instance, they claim that this is company proprietary information. Then you have to go back and say, well, if it is indeed, that you do a third-party notice, there's a whole process there. In addition, you can also have to go back and argue, okay, well, can you not, redact? So there's severance in our Information Act. So really that's a more of that back and forth. And as a side note, POPIA has really impacted on access to information because we get so many kind of people coming to say, oh, there's a personal information in it, we can never share it with you. And that is a huge problem at the moment. And we're trying to navigate that with the information regulator. Costs are also an obstacle. So just to, we sometimes get asked to provide per page payment for a document that's provided to us electronically over PDF. And, sometimes, you want the information, that's really what we're going for. And you just pay because it's easier rather than fighting them on the payment aspect and then potentially going to an internal appeal. That is a huge problem as well. Sometimes in the information, the actual participants in the procurement fraud are obscured through shell companies, etc. And at the moment, our beneficial ownership transparency laws are not quite where they need to be to enable journalists to follow the money. So there, we are, actively campaigning for the Companies Act to be amended so that that type of information is provided, and we can follow the money much more easily. Whistleblowers, and this was something that Judge Zondo obviously touched on, very important. They don't feel empowered to come to us to make disclosures and report on suspected irregularities. Tip-offs are huge in journalism and investigative journalism because it's sometimes the spark that ignites a very important investigation. So for instance, with the Gupta leaks, huge efforts had to be expended to ensure that the whistleblowers that made the leaks were actually safely out of the country at the time. It was a very sensitive operation. And in South Africa, where whistleblowers don't feel safe, and a tragic example is Babita Deokaran. But where whistleblowers don't feel safe, they will not come to the media. And that is really, there's probably so much that we don't know about just because of that. There's also a lack of awareness about access to information laws and procedures. So we were getting information from a major university in South Africa, and we contacted them and we said, first there was no PIA manual available on the website at all. And we basically had to go to their contacts page and send an email to every single person, their random admissions officers and the like, just to get, and they very happily sent us back a draft PIA manual, which is so, I mean, for a major university to only, not have all of this in order after POPI and PIA have been in effect. It was very concerning. But we also sent that request over 2 weeks ago, and we've yet to receive even an acknowledgement of receipt. So really, it seems that there's not all is in place there. Then, I mean, willful obstruction, and this is probably one of the most frustrating. An example there is we made a request for information from a state-owned company. We also could not find a PIA manual anywhere. And kind of, there were the official email channels, and on the side, we actually had one of the officials saying what she was doing internally, saying, I'm really trying to get this done. I'm hitting this roadblock and that roadblock. And eventually we wanted to appeal, and we asked them, where is your PIA manual? You must have one. And basically delay, no response. And she phoned me afterwards to say that she had been instructed not to provide it. So basically, they were really putting up every kind of, obstacle in our way to prevent us from getting that information. So I'll jump very quickly, if I've still got a little minute or two, Zakiswa, to go to how advocacy, so when it comes to the Zondo Commission recommendations, where there's, for instance, the idea of the public procurement body, that's an excellent idea, and the media can certainly report on that, report on the activities, ensure that that institution will understand that their activities are, within the public scrutiny, because as we know, such institutions are very susceptible to capture. We don't want that to happen. And also, if there's a professionalized public procurement service, the media has really reported on malfeasance within the professional service industries like law and management consulting and the like. So that can also be an area of scrutiny. When it comes to working together, Amabugane is somewhat unusual in that we've got a dedicated advocacy program, and we have for many years, and it has that specific mandate to advocate for these issues. But there's a very strong delineation between what we do in terms of advocating for media freedom and access to information, and as I mentioned, like wading into the processes. So where, for instance, there's a process to appoint a new Chief Justice, it would not be within our mandate to make submissions on who should be the next Chief Justice, but we can certainly report on that process as we've done. So it's important to maintain that distinction, but beyond that, there's definitely scope to collaborate, and Amabungane certainly has, with Corruption Watch, PARI, the Helen, to advance issues like transparency. So, and I think in that sense, it's important to bring that media perspective of how these laws work or don't work in the context of media into these submissions and these the litigation, because media, as we know, is really important to a healthy democracy. So it's very important that the voice of the media is heard when making these advocacy interventions, so that we can really ensure that these laws are fit for purpose in a very broad sense. So I think those are my submissions. I hope I haven't gone over time, but thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Cherise. And last but definitely not least, we're going to hear from Theo from the Open Government Partnership.
Thank you very much, Zuki, and definitely thank you to the Open Contracting Partnership for organizing this discussion. And I think as my colleagues have said, this discussion is happening at a very timely moment, as the Zondo Commission begins to bring out the reports. Although long, I should say the reports are quite long. So I'm Theo Chiviru with the Open Government Partnership, and the Open Government Partnership is a global partnership of now 78 governments and 76 local governments that work to advance, work with reformers to advance the principles of transparency, accountability, and citizen participation. And South Africa is a founding member of the OGP, and I think South Africa now and I will talk about it probably during my presentation, is how South Africa has been in terms of the Open Government Partnership and some of the commitments that South Africa has made through the OGP. Now, I think where I want to start is what the Zondo Commission says around civil society. And I think part of the recommendations that are coming from the Zondo report, the first one at least, is talking about how underutilized the partnership between civil society and government has been. And I think there is a recognition from the report itself that civil society have not been involved, especially in the monitoring of public procurement in South Africa. And I think that there have been quite a big underutilization. And I think it even speaks about that the current legislations that government is developing and discussing around, that help in terms of addressing corruption and money laundering, have not made an attempt to create a partnership with civil society. So I think already, if you look at that, there is a challenge in terms of the partnership between government and civil society. And I think there is an underutilization and government engagement with civil society and with civil society. So I think it speaks, to the nature of where government sees itself in terms of what its role in terms of delivery around governance without civil society. And I think that in itself, is a major challenge. And obviously the Zondo Commission report does give, and the fact that it gives states to that, it reflects a big challenge. And I think there is an opportunity, when you look at it from a civil society point of view, that there is an opportunity for civil society to find a way of actually engaging government in terms of the recommendations that are coming out of the report. Sorry, Zuki, can you hear me? My network seemed to have dropped. Okay, good. Because as the Open Government Partnership, for the last 10 years that we have been, that since the founding of the partnership, we have seen how powerful and how important collaboration between government and civil society can be, because the partnership itself was built on the model of government and civil society coming together, thinking together in terms of the challenges that countries are facing, both at the national level, but also at the local level, and co-creating reforms that actually enable the transformation of people's lives, especially around issues of anti-corruption. And we have a lot of examples. If you look at, for example, in Ukraine, with ProZorro and DoZorro, where the collaboration between government and civil society has enabled to create a very transparent, open, participatory procurement process that is in the public scrutiny. And I think the government of Ukraine would not have been able to do that without the partnership of civil society, because that partnership brings in a perspective and skills and a voice that governments don't have, because of the nature of how governments are built. So I think if you also go to countries like Ecuador, for example, in terms during the COVID-19, where the partnership between government and civil society has enabled the creation of a very open and participatory public procurement system, an e-procurement system that enables civil society together with citizens to hold government to account. And I think when you look at the Zondo report, it speaks largely about that, when it speaks about the partnership between government and civil society in terms of how do we empower citizens, how do we empower the civil society to be able to hold government to account, but to also make sure that whatever public procurement system comes out of this process, it is open, it is participatory, but also engages and enables civil society and citizens to be able to hold government to account. So I think right from the start, and I think what the Zondo report provides for us is an opportunity for advocacy, right, as civil society, because it speaks on these issues. It speaks of the gaps that these issues have actually brought up because of the lack of collaboration with civil society. But I think there is a role that we as civil society can play, because we shouldn't expect, especially when we're talking about the government in South Africa, that it will just give us the space to to build those partnerships, because I think there's always been a resistance from government in terms of building these partnerships. There's underutilization, they don't see the use, but we need to build it. We need to make sure that governments understand the value of these partnerships. And I think, if you look at, even when you look at South Africa, back in South Africa, if you look at, the partnership that government and Imali has built, and I think that has been a very strong partnership. That is a good example that we need to be sharing with government in terms of what that partnership can really build in terms of, in terms of what is coming out of the Zondo Commission and the lessons that we're getting from Fuleka Mali, which is a partnership with Imali too, is very important. And I think taking those lessons and building them and bringing them into this discussion around the Zondo Commission will be very important, because I think it's all about, at the end of the day, taking the information from, because as I said, I think all of us have agreed that it's, if the first report is 800 pages, all the other reports that are going to come are actually going to be longer. There's a role that we as civil society can play in terms of taking that information that is the 800 pages and, and communicating it to the citizen in language and in ways that citizens are able to be empowered to understand what is actually happening in the report. Because I think as things stand, I think when I look at it, at least, is that the information is not yet with the citizen. I think a lot of citizens know that there is a report that has come from the Zondo Commission, but have we as civil society taken that information to the citizen to say, this is what the Zondo report is saying. This is what, the 4 years and the billion rands that have been spent on the commission are actually saying in terms of corruption. And I think it goes down in terms of making sure that we're simplifying the information in a way that let's empower the citizen. I think we as civil society need to play that role, because without building a movement that understands what the reports are saying, government will always never see the value of why they need to partner with civil society. Because I think government is more scared of the citizen, because they understand the implications of citizens understanding what is in the Zondo report. So I think we as civil society need to play that role, and that will advance and push government to actually build the partnership. Because if we're able to explain to citizens, right, that the amount of money that has been spent, that was stolen, through Translate, through SARS, for example, through the service consultancies that a lot of these institutions build, and what effect that would have had on education, what that would have done in terms of health, what that would have done in terms of of transport and so forth. All this money should be servicing the citizens, and them understanding really what it all means to their daily life, to their children, and to their daily lives. That can be enabled to build a movement. Because I think at the moment, civil society, I should say, and I should credit this to a lot of to civil society in South Africa, the pressure that they put, that resulted in the in the public protector report years back, and then the creation of the Zondo Commission, the amount of pressure that civil society put in terms of that. But now, as the process went and civil society being involved, we're at a point where now findings are coming out, that are implicating a lot of people. Civil society need to take back the narrative, because at the moment, the report and this process of the Zondo Commission is being used by politicians and by the different parties within the country for grandstanding. We need to take back that narrative and build the narrative that speaks to citizens, in terms of making sure that the same pressure that civil society gave government and gave the state years back, that is the same pressure that we need to build at the moment. Because I think now we're at a point where we need to build that engagement. We need to force government to build the partnerships, and platforms like the Open Government Partnership are there to do exactly that, and enable, I think, citizens to, for civil society and government to partner in terms of building reforms. One of the key findings, last year, as we 10 years as OGP, we found is that the model works, where government and civil society partner to co-create reforms. The model works because it shows that, I think the study that we've done shows that where there is that collaboration, where there is that partnership that is built, there are better results, there are better reforms, and citizens, it actually transforms citizen lives. For example, if I take you to Liberia, where one of the biggest issues that Liberia had faced that caused, wars in Liberia was the issue of land. And when Liberia joined OGP and made a commitment to reform to put in place, necessary processes and necessary legislation to transform the distribution of land in Liberia, working with civil society and citizens. Only then did the process of land ownership, land use, and land distribution become more transparent. And that in itself empowered citizens to be able to engage government. So that I think that process of firstly, partnering with civil society, but also, as my colleagues have spoken about, the issue of transparency, making sure that whatever that partnership does, there's transparency, putting out information there, citizens understanding what is happening, as I said in the beginning, really taking the information in the Zondo report and make it, put it in language that citizens understand. But the next step in that, because transparency is the first step. Transparency alone, or even giving citizens information in terms of what is happening with the Zondo is the first step. Is then creating in making sure that citizens are able to participate, because that is where sometimes the civil society we lose the ball. So if you look, for example, in the process in Liberia on the land issue, while civil society and government disclosed the information, what actually made the difference was actually creating spaces where citizens are able to engage. And this is where I think we as civil society, as we go through this process of the Zondo Commission and the report, need to do. Let's create the spaces where citizens engage together with government, obviously. So I hope I still have 3 more minutes.
You do not have 3 more minutes, Theo, but you're happy. I'm happy for you to wrap up.
Yes. So I think one of the things that is really to make sure that we retake the narrative. Let's not leave the narrative in the hands where it is now. As civil society, let's take it and rebuild it again. And I think the one other thing that I would like to say to civil society is we need to play the bureaucratic politics. And I think, especially in South Africa, which I call bureaucratic politics. Let's understand the reformers. There are reformers within government. How do we partner with them? How do we build relationships with them? Because without that, without knowing the reformers and building the relationship with the reformers, we won't achieve what we want to achieve. So I think we have seen within OGP, and I think, if I talk of, I think numerous examples, if I take you to Nigeria around the discussion around beneficial ownership disclosure, starting all the way from where the process started a couple of years back, where we were working, I was quite engaged in the process, working with NATI, in terms of finding the reformers in government who are interested in these issues and who understands and see the value of the open government approach in terms of making sure that we build this partnership. I think we need to understand the reformers. Let's play the bureaucratic game, the bureaucratic politics within government, and understanding how government functions, because without understanding how government functions, it's very difficult to navigate it, to play even the bureaucratic politics. So let's understand it and let's work with the reformers. Let's identify them. And I think a lot of civil society that I've worked with, in this space in anti-corruption for the last couple of years, we know how to do that. Let's intensify that and make sure that we have all the reformers that we need on our side, supporting the work that we do, because these are the partnerships. And one thing I have to say, that working with the OGP and understanding, globally in the 78 countries that we work in, there's always going to be resistance, because there are people that do not want this information to be in the public domain. But we have to push. But at the same time, there are people that have an interest that want this information to get this information go out. So again, I should end by saying there is an opportunity for civil society. I know that the OGP process in South Africa has not been the most smooth process, because it has faced a number of challenges for the last 10 years. But I think I should say that I think the Zondo report and the findings and the recommendations that are coming out of this report create a new opportunity for civil society to re-engage in the process and advocate and use the process. I mean, if you look at, I think if you look at the Ecuador example that I gave you, one of the reasons that, the civil society in Ecuador highlight is that if we didn't have a commitment in the OGP action plan, we might have not succeeded in what we are advancing. Civil society in Nigeria also say, if we did not have a commitment in the OGP action plan, the beneficial ownership process might not have been where it is. And even if you look at Vuleka Mali itself in South Africa, it started as a commitment within the OGP process. So while the process in itself has been frustrating for civil society, I do think that the Zondo report, the Zondo recommendations create a fresh opportunity for civil society to re-engage with the OGP process. This year, South Africa is co-creating its 5th action plan. My advice is, I think we need to work and take some of these recommendations, turn them into commitments, into the 5th action plan for South Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, Theo. Thank you very much, Theo, and thank you to each of our panelists. What we're going to do now, I think we're doing decently for time. We had hoped to have a representative from the coalition that Theo has spoken about, Imali Yetu Coalition, which is working with the National Treasury on a particular project looking and essentially an open government initiative. But given that Theo has touched on that, I think we are actually, and I promise I didn't cue him to do that. I think there has been space created to have a conversation about, the role of coalitions. This has come up a few times. Civil society coalitions on the one hand, and on the other, the role of multi-stakeholder platforms and multi-stakeholder engagements, which include government entities. What I'd like to do now, I'm going to ask each panelist to be on the ready. I'm going to throw a question each at you and then really just open up to the floor. And when we do open up, I think, as I said before, really keen to hear other voices, to hear other ideas come into the space before we wrap up our discussion, which Caroline will close us off on. So before we do the questions, there was a particular paragraph within the report that, as we've been talking about state-owned or state entities, something that struck me in it, and I think each of the speakers has touched on aspects of this, and I'll read it verbatim from the report. It relates to someone called Mr. Dawa, who was the Chief Procurement Officer at South African Airways until his suspension. And it's the passage reads, is it Mr. or Dr. Dawa testified that there were significant problems with the procurement process when he arrived at South African Airways. SAA did not keep proper records of tender documents and contracts. They were kept loose in various drawers. One of the main audit findings around the time was that documents would simply go missing and were not available for inspection. And those who are familiar with the report will also recall the kind of pressure that was faced by many officials within this space. And I think this is an important thing to throw into our conversation. We'll start with, I think, in any order that the speakers want to go in, but I'll put the questions out and perhaps you can write them down, and then we open up. On that point of documentation and tender records, I'd like to, Edwin, you spoke about the importance of e-procurement. I'd be very curious to hear from your experience in Uganda, and in particular, I'm aware that there's an open procurement portal there. Do you have sort of specific lessons that we might glean from your experience there, but also looking at what's being done in Uganda, lessons for the South African context? And I'd be keen to hear as well if you have ideas around the beneficial ownership question. Saran, and I'll just throw them all out, write them down, and then I'll just, it might be in this order, it's up to you how you answer them. Corruption Watch's work has addressed procurement and anti-corruption work from a wide range of angles, like you've mentioned, including work within the Imali Yetu Coalition, which we've spoken about. And this is work also involving work directly with the National Treasury. Could you elaborate on some of the transparency-related reform issues, and in particular, what you think in the short, medium, or long term we should prioritize? You had spoken about sort of what can we do now, what can we do later? But maybe if you could hone in on kind of right now on the transparency agenda, what you think is a key focus or should be a key focus. And Charisse, you spoke, and I think just to say again, your creation of another way of thinking about civil society and our various roles is quite important. You mentioned that information is the lifeblood of journalism, which really struck with me, and I think it's important even in the context of civil society advocacy work. So the role of investigative journalism, for me, has certainly highlighted the issue of access to information. Given your work, and you did mention your kind of, and I think Carrie called you a chameleon in the chat. Given your role, what would you say right now around the particular ways, on the one hand, of deepening access to information reform, but also on the other hand, using civic tech? Should we be using more civic tech, or what should we really be doing? I'm curious to know, given the different work that you've done, and in particular kind of that access to information and managing masses of data is there a better, stronger role for civic tech within this space? Theo, absolutely, the OGP context is important. And I wonder if, in particular, in relation to open contracting, what would you say right now should be a core focus? So there's the kind of broad framing of the OGP agenda in South Africa. But what would you say really if we had limited capacity to further the OGP agenda? What should we be doing right now, with that in mind? And given your knowledge and experience of this context and other contexts across the continent, actually. I know that Edwin was already ready to jump into his question. Edwin, should we go with you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Zuki. And well, on the issue of that section of the report that you raised, and I think everyone who's into public procurement across Africa or the world knows that that's not a unique situation. The documentation in public procurement is very, very heavy, and I would imagine an agency like the South African Airways will probably need a huge warehouse to keep all the documentation related to public procurement, because these tender documents are big. And so keeping some of those records, even without elements of corruption, just becomes difficult. And that's why there's a movement across the continent or even globally to start automating these processes, because it helps a lot in terms of documentation. And in public procurement has been a laggard as far as automating is concerned, because if you go to the other public finance management systems like the accountancy, most of them have been automated. You can't imagine if we are still banking systems, if we are still using the manual processes, how difficult it would be. So it's just therefore self-evident that we need to automate these processes. And there are countries that have moved in this direction: Uganda, Zambia, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Ghana. Of course, it's early days, but what is important and what South Africa, and of course South Africa has also moved in that direction. What's important is to have a clear strategy of how you're going to implement e-procurement, because it's very easy to, get the specifications, requirements of a system, tender it out, and get an e-procurement system built. The problem is that, as we have been seeing from some countries, it's not as easy when it comes to implementation, and not because systems are complicated, but the hearts and minds, the change management is very important. And so from the very beginning, it's very important that as you think through e-procurement, you involve all the stakeholders, civil society, the bidders, or the private sector, the government agencies, because when the government agencies have unique requirements, there are government agencies like the state-owned enterprises that run more or less like a commercial entity. Then there are those that get money directly from the government. So all those, to build a system that speaks to all those agencies is very crucial to have a system that incorporates all their requirements. So in Uganda's case, we also had the government procurement portal first. This was to put certain information out there, which in a way prepared agencies to adopt a full e-government procurement system, the government procurement portal. We are piloting that. We piloted that first so that we strengthen it before we roll out every government agency. And that's the same approach most countries have used, Zambia, Tanzania, and Rwanda. South Africa, of course, is also unique because you kind of have a federal arrangement where states have some independence, and also your laws related to procurement are a bit, if I may put it, a bit scattered. So that's why the other legislative framework we discussed earlier is very important, because e-procurement can also be only successful if you have a strong legislative framework that allows it. On the issue of beneficial ownership, it's very important, but almost impossible to also do if you don't have an e-procurement system. Why? Because in the manual system, it's very hard to link these systems with other systems that can give you proper information. So in the case of Uganda, the EGP system, the e-government procurement system, is linked to the Registration Services Bureau, the one where companies are registered and they have to put their directors and beneficial owners. So that information is picked directly from those agencies. So if Edwin is a director in a company and is bidding in a certain government agency, the systems speak to each other such that that information is just collected from the other platforms. Under a manual system, it would become difficult because you just depend on what people are filling in the forms. And then it becomes, of course, very difficult to keep doing due diligence on the information that they are giving you. But for those that may not be familiar, beneficial ownership was described well by Theo on how Theo, Sherry is one of them, I think, spoke to it, why it's very important, because it shows you who are the beneficiaries of these contracts, the direct beneficiaries. Many times in government procurement, the faces of the beneficiaries are not so obvious, and that sometimes leads to insider trading, if I may put it, and corrupt tendencies. So that's it, maybe that I could comment on the two issues of e-procurement and beneficial ownership. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Edwin. And just noting Prof. Hio's comment that your use of the word scattered to describe the South African context is diplomatic. Yeah, Charisse, Karen, Theo.
Oh, yeah, you can go ahead if you like.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Keep going.
Thanks. Yeah, so your question is about priorities, right? About the strategy of what we should prioritize in pushing for transparency. And I think when we think about a question like that, you have to ask the question, what are the bottlenecks to implementing these recommendations to begin with, you know? And the typical answer that gets trotted out is twofold. It's a lack of political will and a lack of technical capacity. And we can, you know, there's quite a lot of lies behind that, but I think generally those are the two sources of difficulty for achieving systemic reform. So I think when you think about priority, you need to weigh the value that the implementing a recommendation would have, the impact that would have, against the likelihood of its implementation. Is at least, I think, like, you know, a realist answer to that question. So given that, I think what I would say fits in that framework most neatly would be this idea of protection for whistleblowers, and specifically of incentivizing whistleblowers to make disclosures, which I touched on in my main speech. And the reason I single that out is because even though it doesn't directly relate to procurement, it's a simple tweak that, yeah, you know, it requires some amount of political will to get passed. But if you do change it, it doesn't rely on the increased technical capacity necessarily of the current system. Whereas when you think about something like establishing an independent agency, which would be amazing and would have, I think, immense value, there are real challenges in how you get that organization properly resourced, how you ensure its independence. And that's not to say those are not valuable and we shouldn't pursue them. I absolutely think that they are. But I also think that, you know, allowing for incentivized disclosures would almost be a quick win in that sense. Similarly, the idea of, you know, embedding the OECD principles in every procurement system is a good one. But I think given that one of the central problems we're dealing with here is that there's a lack of capacity in, you know, because the power to procure goods in government exists at the national, provincial, and municipal level, as well as in SOEs. There are hundreds of bodies that have this power. So ensuring that those principles are implemented in every system, I think, is quite a challenge. So yeah, my first answer would be about the incentivized disclosures because of its potential efficacy as a policy change. And then secondly, I'd want to talk, as I said earlier, about lobbying the government to take action on the status of the public procurement bill, on the national anti-corruption strategy. And I think, concretely, what do you do there? I think there's various forms for engagement with government. For example, at NEDLAC, if they do establish the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council that the NATS demands, that would be another forum where you can take forward this action. So I think this, putting pressure on government, but also fostering a relationship that allows these other changes to get put through would be a priority. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Darren. Theo, you'd had your mic on. Thanks.
No, thank you. So your question was, what would be a priority for civil society moving forward, right? If I got that correctly.
Yeah.
So I think, taking lessons from some of the processes that we have seen as the OGP, and not only in South Africa, but across the continent. I think the first thing is for civil society to be clear about what they want government to do. Because I think so many times, civil society, we are all over the place in terms of, we have so many demands. But when you look at the Zondo report, what is the priority? And I think advocacy is a long project. And I think we need to understand that. Because if you look at, for example, one of the discussions that we have been having within the beneficial ownership discussion in South Africa has been, for the last five years or so, we have been talking about, we need a public register on beneficial ownership information. And I think until last year, the discussion sort of has changed, right? To say, probably we need a policy that harmonizes all the discussions around beneficial ownership disclosure. So my advice, I think, for civil society, I think what I would even suggest that let's have a civil society indaba, somewhere, to discuss how we prioritize our advocacy around what we want government to do, what we want government to do coming out of the Zondo report, because I think there's a lot in there that is coming out. So if we don't prioritize as civil society, it will be difficult for us to get what we want, but it will take us longer as well to be able to achieve our goals. And I think, obviously, let's leverage on what is already existing. I think, for the longest time, there's been a procurement legislation that has existed. There's a draft. How do we leverage on that? Because I think the discussion has already started. How do we leverage on that and strengthen that, right? How do we leverage processes like the OGP process to make sure that we enable government to make commitments at that level and use those processes to be able to continuously advocate for government to actually implement some of these reforms. So I think it's almost saying that let's stagger, let's understand what we want. But I think one key important issue is how do we leverage on each other's strengths, right? So you have Amabungani that is working with journalists that can get information, that can work with journalists and on investigative journalism. We have other organizations that are policy developers, think tanks. We have civil society that are focused on advocacy. We have civil society that are working with grassroots. How do we leverage on each other's, on each other's strength to get what we want? Because I think that is where networking and coalition building is. I would really suggest that there is an opportunity for civil society to have a civil society in Indaba, somewhere, just relax and discuss the report and what is coming out of the report, and how do we work together as civil society to make sure that we get what we want. Because without that, it will take us longer to achieve what we want, but also we'll get a lot of resistance. So, because we know that our government sometimes uses divide and rule, right, in terms of working with civil society, but we need to take that out and make sure that we speak as one voice and become a coalition.
Thanks, Theo. Thank you. Sharice.
Thanks so much. So my question was more to access to information, what types of reforms are required, and also the role that civic tech can play in that. And I would, there's so many interventions and advocacy initiatives on the go, trying to advocate for better access to information. If I can refer to Media Monitoring Africa is they've put out a draft PIA amendment bill. So that one is kind of meant to bring PIA, which is a 20-year-old piece of legislation, into the modern era. As we know, it's very paper-based and not very kind of technology-focused. So I think that's definitely something that is going to help, and we hope that that will actually be adopted and made into legislation. I would also say that, you know, civic tech has definitely got a lot there's definitely a lot that can contribute to access to information, to assist the work of journalists, but also other watchdogs in performing their role. So things like the open contracting data standard, if that is implemented across, for instance, South Africa's, if that's implemented across South Africa's systems, that will certainly help when it comes to different departments and bringing together their information, so that, as you mentioned, it can be readable and understandable. You know, something that I can just refer to, this is not really something that's intended to be civic tech. It's not really bringing it to the people, but the Gauteng high courts have implemented case lines as a method of document management. And the COVID directives have provided that, you know, previously journalists would have to go to court, you'd have to make arrangements to get the file, it would take very long to do so. And it would basically be a very long and laborious process to get physical access to the court records. And what we'd have to do is basically take our phones and scan using our Adobe Scan on our phones, or, you know, use the court systems to photocopy. Really just a very painful process. And with case lines, the COVID directives have provided for journalists to obtain access to court records online. And the process to get there is not super smooth sailing. You have to go through the judge's secretary, and sometimes they're non-responsive. But, you know, especially during COVID, where you didn't want to be driving out to these courts, the time and effort that access via case lines has provided has actually been immense. It's really like almost changed the game. And almost when we have to go to the Western Cape or KwaZulu-Natal or other places, we almost like, oh, they don't have case lines. So it's just an example of how great a well-run system, and it's well-run because it's obviously the judiciary and they're kind of dealing with lawyers. And I feel like when it comes to kind of things like civil society and the information that we require, there's not that kind of interest and effort put into making accessible systems. What we want are databases. We want proactive disclosure. We don't want to have to use PIA. We want to use PIA where there's something quite niche and specific, maybe not something that would ordinarily be considered necessary, you know, for public consumption. But things like procurement information, absolutely. There should be repositories of information for that. Deal with the POPIA aspects at the outset. Have them submit two versions: a POPIA safe version where there's, you know, personal information redacted. You know, find ways to actually make that, you know, something where they can provide information at the outset. So that is really what we're looking for, and we don't believe that it's very difficult to set up these programs. It's just, as Taryn mentioned earlier, political will. So really what we want is to concentrate our advocacy activities towards that. And I think it'll be beneficial to a number of players, not just journalists. Thanks.
Excellent. Great, Charisse. And just, by opening up cards really, or putting cards on the table, one of the reasons I did raise that was, you know, some of what's coming out of, you know, the procurement reform working group, some members of which are represented on this call today. And I'm hoping we can maybe, now that we're opening up the floor, hear a bit more about that. Also really glad to have heard, you know, mention of the draft procurement bill, which I think is also a really important sort of area of advocacy for us to focus on, consider, get some ideas around what next. Thanks, everyone. Now, I'm very excited and really hoping that I'll see some faces, hear some voices, also put things in the chat. We're opening up the floor. We'll keep an eye for in the chat box. I'll keep an eye out for hands up, but really preferable to hear voices. The first voice is from my good friend from Malawi, Leon, who I haven't seen in a very long time. And Leon just piggybacks on the questions around the OGP. And it mentions in he sent a message to me saying that he's aware that governments on the African continent are not obligated by any international instrument to make specific commitments and domesticate functional frameworks. Theo, I hope you're listening because this is for you. And he's not entirely clear if Malawi is amongst the 78 countries within the OGP, but he does say that in the absence of enforceable legal instruments, OGP in Malawi would only, or is only, a rose flower decorating the government offices. So he suggests, what about developing one for AU as a way of piloting? And I think this does have linkages, does have alignment with the South African context. We're going to hold it there. Theo, I hope you've made note of that, of Leon's question. And I'm also seeing quite a bit in the chat. Can I ask anyone who's able to just actually jump in? You can put your hand up. I'll have a note of that. You're also welcome to just put things in the chat. I'm seeing quite some interesting things in the chat. I'll read out the chat now, but preferable are voices and faces. Anyone with any additional questions, but also sort of concrete ideas to throw into the mix around what is our strategy going forward? What is the role of civil society in particular, based on what we've heard so far, but also anything else within the space that is fundamental for us to consider. Okay, some intense clamoring. Shall I, while I'll also look out for, if I could also just ask colleagues to help me make sure that I'm not missing any hands. In the interim, I'll read additional comments. I'm not sure if some are comments or suggestions. Okay, I see Sharice's comment around, okay, in fact, Tandira raises the issue that corruption in procurement has brought many interested parties into the fold with the intention of curbing what is going wrong. Tandira says that clear roles and responsibilities will go a long way to ensuring that everyone is able to bring in value in all of this. And I think that's an aspect of what we're trying to get at today, is around the kind of roles and responsibilities. And Theo touched on various areas of expertise that different people in civil society raise. Jonathan, I do wonder if you'd like to please jump in there, or are you happy for me to read your comment?
Well, I'm happy for you to read it.
I'd prefer to hear your voice, Jonathan. Let's go.
Okay, I do want to point out for the techies that my face technically is in the chat because I uploaded it.
Thank you.
But anyway, yeah, okay. No, I just wanted to underline, I mean, thank you for the discussion, and Zuki, thank you for, pulling it together, OCP, etc. But yeah, I thought actually that was very interesting what Sharice was mentioning. It's a little, in some ways, kind of off base from the specific procurement, but yeah, but it really relates because she's pointing to, it's a techie kind of point, right? That we need well-resourced databases. And then, as I said there, at least minimal willingness to proactively disclose the publicly available documents. So it's very interesting that, and maybe the Western Cape, I know there are other people on this call, maybe the Western Cape needs to get up to Gauteng standards here. But yeah, there's finances and there's a public mission of actually disclosing in that case. Certainly helps with some of the accountability for procurement more generally. But I think it's an interesting issue of openness, just like she said. It's there's some interesting case law that goes back to what's called an open justice principle. And I think this is an example of that. And I think we must ask Sharice to write it up.
Thanks for that, Jonathan.
Thanks. If I can just Yeah, if I can jump in very quickly. Yes, I mean, this is access to courts and openness of court records is definitely something that Amabongani is, we definitely want to focus on it a lot more this year. And I think just on that openness aspect, it's more about how can we get government to understand that the default position should be disclosure. And I think that, in terms of our constitution, it's constitutionally tenable. And so where it comes to these things, and I think we can speak to a little bit of, we've submitted a promotion of access to information request for the submissions that were made to the public procurement bill. And we were told that there were thousands of them. But the question, and we had a kind of informal chat with someone from the office of the procurement office, and they were just kind of, why don't you just let us carry on with what we're doing? And we said, what we want is to be able to see these submissions in parallel to the process that is unfolding. And we kind of wanted just the raw submissions, so not necessarily kind of process submissions or comments by the Treasury on them. We just wanted to see what the submissions are. And what we suggest is that should be something that's default when it comes to all legislation, that where there's submissions received from the public, why not have a database where you can access those? So really we need a paradigm shift where there's a default position of access to information, and secrecy or confidentiality, or I would call it secrecy, is the exception to the norm. And I think civic tech is the way. I mean, if we were talking about a paper-based system, that would obviously not be possible. But we have the technology resources, they exist, and we see that they can, when properly, as Jonathan mentioned, we're properly resourced, and there's that will to get it going, it can be immensely helpful.
If I can just come in there quickly, Zuki.
Please, yeah.
Because from what Charisse is, just following on from what Charisse has said, like if we can actually see, for instance, the comments on the public procurement bill, we'll get some idea of how many of the different actors in the procurement system are aware and engaging and putting in their concerns to this legislative drafting process, which is an important part of the reform efforts, but clearly not the whole of the reform efforts. And very, I think that's part of why we want the comments, precisely to see, what is the balance between centralization and decentralization, what's optimum in, or at least what's the current balance there, for instance, on the comments, and how might that indicate what might be optimum in terms of centralization, decentralization, in terms of reform going forward. And we wouldn't get to see that, or at least we could do the analysis ourselves, and that would help at the moment.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jonathan and Charisse. I'm gonna, just before we come back to the OGP question, I think there's an interesting point raised here about whistleblower protection. And I know that, again, many on the call are doing work in this area, but, Corruption Watch being on the panel come to mind immediately. Mtabisi Moyo, I won't pressurize you as I did Jonathan to kind of voice yourself, but I'll read the comment, and if you would like to elaborate, please feel free to, but I think it's an important one to raise. Mtabisi says he's a former unionist who led the expose of corruption within an economic development agency in the Gauteng provincial government. Having experienced the brutal retaliation by the employer leading to my dismissal, my take is coalition initiatives to deal with state capture recommendations need to also strengthen partnerships with unions at branch levels, such as union leadership at floor level. Strengthened relations with civil society and media kind of emboldens whistleblowers who not only consist of employees, but will encourage other internal government reformers to come out. A focus on the protection of whistleblowers promotes transparency, which in itself is an anti-corruption prevention strategy. really important point, and I think one that has been raised on the panel. But I would certainly say that is an important aspect, given in fact what Sharice mentioned as well about the risks that whistleblowers face. And Sharice, okay, just providing more information about the public access to information that we've opened up on the bill submissions. Yeah, and just mentioning members of the Procurement Reform Working Group that are kind of behind that work. Thanks, Sharice. Also keeping an eye out for hands. Yeah, Thea, I'm not sure if you do want to weigh in. I mean, the idea is to have a conversation and have ideas and strengthening our kind of way forward. But if you do have anything in response to Leon's point earlier, that would be interesting, particularly around the role of the AU, which regional in function, but certainly is, given the APRM discussion or context and OGP context, is worth considering for South Africa, of course.
Yeah, so just a few thoughts, but before I get to that, I think just to add to, I think to Tabisi's comment, I think it goes back to what I was saying in terms of the partnerships, the networks need to go beyond civil society, right? So, because I think we need to build coalitions and partnerships as wider as possible, sort of what I would call broadening the base, right? To make sure that we have a strong base of institutions that are supporting the process. For example, you know, the private sector is also, I think one of the speakers spoke about the role that even the report itself, the Zondo report, speaks of the role that the private sector played in this whole process, you know, with the McKenzies of this world, the role that they played. So also building partnerships with the private sector is very important. And I think we as civil society, on the other hand, as part of our advocacy, is to make sure that we work with private sector and understand some of the issues that the private sector are pushing on. I mean, for example, a couple of years back when we were pushing for beneficial ownership to be included in the FIC amendment bill, one of the things that we realized was that government was for it, but there was a lot of resistance from the private sector. And because we had not built a partnership with the private sector, government obviously found it quite easy to listen to the private sector more than they could listen to us as civil society. So I think I think it's very important, especially now, as we take advocacy processes that are coming out of the Zondo Commission. So the unions are important, the private sector is important, the reformers within government are important, but also even the local governments also are important, because a lot of the procurement that actually is happening at the local level. So how do we bring in, you know, the community organizations? How do we bring in the reformers at the local level? So I think it's also important that we partner, we do a mapping. And I think I would advise civil society that are advocating around the different issues around whistleblower, public, you know, procurement and so forth, to do a scoping exercise to make sure that as we take this work forward, we have all the people that we need to take these pieces of work forward. And I think straight to the point around OGP and the African Union and so forth. First, I think the first answer is Malawi is a member of OGP, and I have to say that we're actually at a point where we want to, I don't want to say kick out Malawi, because there's not been any engagement from both the government and the civil society in Malawi. So I think it would be good after this call for us to, you know, for just to have a chat in terms of how we can help the Malawi process, because at the moment, you know, civil society is not engaging, and even the government itself. So Leon, it might be good for us to touch base at some point. But I think one thing that I would say is that when, you know, especially when we're talking about anti-corruption processes, every opportunity that we get and every platform that we get to leverage on, I think we should, right? From the G20 processes, if there are opportunities coming out of the G20, processes that are coming off OGP, and leverage on all these processes, because I think what we've found very useful is that processes that create a political moment, that government makes a specific commitment to say, for the next 2 years, or what we want to do is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we as civil society are able to leverage on that to advance, to push our advocacy to make sure that government keeps to this commitment. So, I mean, we as the OGP are in partnership with the Africa peer review mechanism to make sure that at that level, right, at that level, some of the commitments and some of the discussions that are happening on governance, on anti-corruption, have the voices of civil society, creation of processes where that engagement is happening. Because I think there's always, as I said earlier in my presentation, there's always going to be resistance, because what we're doing is, the work that we do is taking away, calling for transparency, is taking away and unlocking and opening up some of the secrecy that is happening behind the scenes. And a lot of people do not like that. And a lot of people are in resistance, a lot of people in power are in resistance of that. So what do? We need to leverage every tool that we can get to advocate for them, for transparency and accountability.
Thanks, Theo. Also seeing in the chat the question from Prof. Gio around why is it taking so long? And this is a question that I've had as well in my mind around processing information in the context of the PIA requests and the procurement bill. I wonder if I can, again, I also understand if it's not possible, but I'd be quite keen for anyone in the space to maybe touch on this aspect of the connection between, I see the comment on that it's beyond urgent, especially following the Constitutional Court's judgment this morning, that effectively invalidated the preferential procurement regulations of 2017. And perhaps for those of us who are not necessarily, and I think Prof. Gio and colleagues have been doing some amazing work in the context of procurement reform or procurement, the legislative and legal aspects of that. I wonder if it would be out of place to ask if you can elaborate on that and the link more broadly to the urgency that you raise, but also understand if that's not possible. And it is possible. Yay.
Sure, Zuki. Thanks for the opportunity, and let me also echo Jonathan's comments. Thanks to everyone for arranging this. It's a very informative discussion. Yeah, so just, to me, it remains an absolute mystery that, we've been talking about reform for, I don't know, Jonathan, how long has it now been that we've been involved with Treasury? Years, literally years. And it's really progressing at a glacial pace, and there's all-round recognition that this is really urgent, that needs to be done. And yet, and as I say, I fully understand that it takes time to work through thousands of submissions, but surely not 2 or 3 years. I see your comment, Jonathan. So one just wonders where's the bottleneck? Where is it that there's not the necessary commitment or will or whatever it is that is causing this thing to be stuck? Because I think, and I really, after COVID, even more so than before, this is really the engine room to get so many other things going in our country. If we can't fix this, then I don't have much hope of anything else really getting moving. So there is a huge frustration. I think, apart from talking about the detail of what should go into that system, and I mean, the bill that they published the year before last had nothing kind of earth-shattering in it. It was basically just writing up what we're doing at the moment. But apart from those details, at least I think one should really start to put pressure to say, let's just get this going. Let's just start somewhere and just get it going. We can refine and work on it over time, but we need to start to get this going. Can't just go around in circles as we're doing now. And so for me, that's a big frustration. And then, this morning, I see Jonathan has also posted the link there to the judgment in the chat for those of you that want to have a look, a long overdue judgment that we've been eagerly waiting, and really has put the cat amongst the pigeons this morning. The Constitutional Court has now handed down judgment in which they've dismissed an appeal by the minister against an order handed down by the Supreme Court of Appeal late in 2020, in which the Supreme Court of Appeal found the preferential procurement regulations to be invalid, with effect from the 2nd of January last year, so 2021. That's all been suspended, of course, while the appeal was pending before the Constitutional Court, but now the Crown Court has handed down judgment, basically just dismissing the appeal, which means that the Supreme Court of Appeal judgment stands. And as we are sitting here now, we don't have a set of preferential procurement regulations. Now, for those that are not that familiar with the South African legal system, it's not just the preferential part that's set out in those regulations. The entire adjudicatory method in terms of how we award tenders in South Africa is set out in those regulations. And they've suddenly this morning, with seemingly retrospective effect, that's another big legal headache, become invalid. And it leaves the entire procurement regime now in a complete vacuum because we just don't know what the rules are. It'll be interesting to see how Treasury responds within the next few days to give some guidance to the system. But, you know, it just shows how untenable our situation has become in the absence of proper legal, consolidated legal reform. And I think, you know, civil society, I think, if we are going to do anything, we should start by putting pressure to say, let's just get going. Let's just start to have something in place because we can't go on like this. And I think then once we got to that point, as some of the comments on the chat has also indicated, then we can start to engage with the details, because I fully agree. Somebody commented earlier on that the draft bill we saw is wholly inadequate in terms of transparency arrangements and all of that. I fully agree with that. But unless we get to that point where something, for example, is tabled in Parliament, it's all shrouded in mystery and moving at this real glacial pace. So my suggestion would be, let's just put pressure on them to bring something to Parliament. Then we can have a proper open process and we're bound to timelines and we can perhaps start moving forward. Thanks, Zuki.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Prof. Really, really helpful. And thanks to Jonathan for sharing that link and I think perhaps we can put it in the discussion document or in the kind of notes document as well, which I have to say, Andy and Caroline, I'm not keeping an eye on, but if there's anything on there that you think we should tease out, let me know. Having said that, we are now very close to our cutoff time, and I think for me, certainly a lot of rich content coming out, a lot of ideas, and it does seem to me that another convening would be valuable, but also based on what we're hearing and what some have suggested already, including you know, Theo's Imbizo point. Because I'm seeing a hand, and I had said it'd be good to hear hands, see voices, no, hear voices, see faces. I see Natasha's hand, and I think directly after Natasha, depending on what your input is, we'll hand over to Caroline, who will close us off. We had set aside 5 minutes for Caroline to kind of wrap up our session. Natasha. You're muted. I'm not sure if you are speaking already.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
There we go.
So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
My question comes back to the comments made on the involvement that private sector can play. So I must confirm I work for EOH. We've been mentioned in the Zondo Commission, and we've gone a long way in being a corporate citizen, cleaning up and building internal controls, being transparent to the market, etc. But I do believe our obligation doesn't stop there, and we have a lot to contribute from a lessons learned, but also maybe from a technical point of view, from an IT perspective. How do we, as private sector, get involved in these working groups?
Okay, that was very quick and to the point, Natasha. Thanks for that. And I think it is important, and it's a pity that we've run out of time, but perhaps we'll, yeah, put that question directly into our conversation, and I think it will inform some of our later engagements. I don't want to speak out of hand. The OCP team might be shaking their heads at me, but their cameras are off, so it's okay. But yeah, thank you for that, and in particular, you know, kind of raising the EOH question, or certainly the private sector. I do see as well that Mark Capers had unmuted himself. If he has a sort of brief input, I'd be keen to hear that, and really now hand over to Caroline.
Thanks, Akiza. I did have a question. I didn't realize I'd unmuted, so obviously I need to ask this question. And I was looking at who's in the room today, and I see, representatives from various organizations, civil society, but I'm not seeing government participating in this conversation. And I do believe that a lot of our challenges, as Prof. Kuno also maybe alluded to, is the speed at which government is moving. So, yeah, I think we have a challenge in terms of bringing, government to the table, and really, it would have been nice to see, government represented and interested in these conversations. So it's kind of a red flag for me in terms of what we want to achieve and what we want to do, and getting the right stakeholders around the table. So yeah, maybe it's more of an observation than a question. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks. Caroline.
Great. Thanks, Suki. And thanks everyone for an incredibly rich discussion. I think all the comments have raised vital points about protection of whistleblowers, about the involvement of the private sector, about the need to create some form of collaborative and directed approach. And I think that this is a fantastic starting point. And I really want to reiterate that we do see this as a starting point. And as Zuki said, there's lots of space for taking this forward. So what I would call on you all to do is, I think you have all our contact details are in the document that both Carrie and Andy shared a little bit earlier in the chat. And we will add all your details to our contact list. And so you'll be on the invite list for further discussions such as this, but also as we take it potentially into the real world out of the virtual world, that hopefully COVID will allow us to have some more in-person discussions. And so we will send out invitations as and when those happen, and please make sure that you do have your contact details listed on that document. But I do want to thank Natasha, particularly for the comment about the private sector, and I think that is a key issue. And with that linked to Mark's comment, I think it allows us to take this discussion forward. The focus of this call was on how civil society can get together and advocate for the implementation of the recommendations. But as we know, and as has come out in many of these conversations, civil society can't do it alone. We need the private sector, and we need to get government involved as well. And so let's use this opportunity to take this discussion, consolidate it, and then we can take it further by involving those other stakeholders. So I really appreciate all the inputs that everyone has given from all the different perspectives, and your observations of personal experiences and ideas on how we can utilize this very specific and unique moment in South African history and take it towards something that is meaningful. So it is exactly 1 o'clock, and so I'd like to close here, but close with a great thanks to everyone, and a commitment from us that we will be taking this conversation forward. So please do look out for a follow-on community call such as this, as well as other initiatives that many of our participants here mentioned as well. So from my side, I'd really like to thank you and wish you a happy afternoon, and a particular thank you to Zuki for facilitating the very, very detailed discussion that we had, and to our presenters who were able to share your experience and your insight with everyone. It's much appreciated to be able to draw on such a wide community of experts that we have access to, and for you to give your time up to share that knowledge and expertise with everyone else is very, very appreciated. So thank you everyone, and looking forward to seeing you again sometime soon.